Perfect.
Okay.
Okay. All right, let's get started, y'all. Welcome to Mara Dreamin'. My name is Tamara, and I'm from Sercante. And for those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. We're very excited to host you here. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and pass it along to our speaker today, Mike Kirkpatrick. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Tamara. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining today's session. I'm really excited to be spending some time with you here at Mara Dreamin'. My name is Mike Kirkpatrick. I am a principal consultant with Heller Consulting. For those of you who aren't aware of Heller, we focus on empowering nonprofit organizations and higher education advancement departments with technology, strategy, CRM planning, implementation, and change management services. And we've been a Salesforce partner since 2008. My background includes 15 years in the nonprofit sector, working here in Canada with a large national healthcare nonprofit, as well as 5 years in higher education. Today's topic, which is key questions for nonprofits considering campaign influence, will be particularly relevant to nonprofit organizations that have or are considering Salesforce and Pardot, or Marketing Cloud Account Engagement as it's now called, and are thinking about implementing campaign influence to help measure the effectiveness of marketing campaigns. On the surface, this topic seems quite straightforward, but once you get into it and peel back the layers and begin thinking about its applicability to various streams of fundraising revenue, there are many questions and considerations that you really need to be thinking about. Today, we'll start out by establishing a baseline of understanding about what campaign influence is and how it actually works. We'll explore the common campaign influence models available with Salesforce and Marketing Cloud Account Engagement. Once we have that common understanding established of how these models work and how influence is measured, we'll examine how this plays out in several different fundraising channels. And finally, if your organization is ready to proceed with implementing campaign influence, I'll leave you with some questions to take away to ensure that you're prepared with the right information as you begin your own journey. Now, before we get started, I'd like to thank our generous sponsors who have come together to make this week's event possible. Events like this are a fantastic professional development and networking opportunity as you look to grow your career in the Salesforce marketing ecosystem. So thanks very much to this group of sponsors. So let's get started by exploring what campaign influence is all about, and specifically, how could it potentially help your nonprofit organization? If you're relatively new to Salesforce, Marketing Cloud Account Engagement, or just the subject of campaign influence, it's important to understand that campaign influence is just the Salesforce terminology for marketing attribution. Now, this term might sound a little more familiar. In its simplest form, it's all about proving the return on your marketing investment. There's a lot of pressure on marketing leadership today to justify their spending on promotion, advertising, and other tactics that drive revenue. And in today's digitally heavy marketing environment, we all know that most marketing activity is measurable in some way, shape, or form. And as such, the expectations to demonstrate measurable impact has never been higher. Marketing attribution is an attempt to assign credit or value to events or touch points. So things like emails, digital ads, calling campaigns, or possibly mobile outreach, which contribute to a desired outcome. And in a fundraising landscape, this could be a donation or an event registration or anything really that has measurable value. If you send an email campaign to ask for donations, marketers and fundraisers are going to ask you how many donations and how much revenue was generated by that email. In Salesforce, those events or touch points take the form of campaigns. The outcome that you're seeking is identified by opportunities, and the amount of credit or value that a campaign receives relative to the total value of that opportunity is called influenced revenue. And this number can vary depending on the attribution model that you're using to measure influence. And we'll dive into that shortly and revisit this graphic to give you some context with some actual numbers. All of this seems pretty simple on the surface, but you still might be asking yourself, what will the impact of implementing this measurement approach be on your organization? This quote from John Wanamaker perhaps best sums it up, and I think you probably all heard this at some point in your career. Half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is I don't know which half. Doesn't it sometimes feel that way when you're rushing campaigns out the door just in time to clear resources to be able to work on the next campaign, often with little time to step back and measure, especially in nonprofit organizations that are trying to do more with less and often struggling to maintain staff resources. But perhaps that makes an even stronger case for nonprofits in particular to have a clear view into their marketing investments because they can ill afford to waste a dollar. A survey published in 2020 revealed, as the quote suggests, that supporting better decision-making with investment in marketing dollars is the #1 benefit identified by respondents by quite a margin. Marketing and sales, or in our case, fundraising, alignment between these two departments is another great benefit because it gets these two areas collaborating on data. Marketing needs to see fundraising results, and fundraising gets to see the impact of the efforts to drive their bottom line. Campaign and channel effectiveness can be looked through a comparative lens using this form of measurement, and depending on the model you're using, the value of multi-touch, multi-channel efforts can start to be measured. And when you can effectively measure your efforts, the last 3 benefits on this chart come into clarity and go hand in hand. You can make a strong case for additional budget, assuming you're seeing positive results, because you're able to tie back outcomes to your efforts, all of which will increase your odds of buy-in at the executive level. There are a number of terms that I'm going to use throughout the session that I think are important to understand campaign influence and how it works. The first, and perhaps the biggest, is Salesforce campaigns. Not all organizations use them, but campaigns are foundational to measuring marketing attribution in Salesforce. They help you organize marketing initiatives, add members who receive and interact with these initiatives. They allow you to create hierarchies so that you can use roll-up reporting, and of course, report on your performance by campaign. Connected campaigns is it's a concept that's introduced when you configure Marketing Cloud account engagement. You have the option to enable connected campaigns, which will make your campaigns visible in both Salesforce and Marketing Cloud account engagement. And in order to accurately attribute revenue across campaigns, many of which will be driven by your Marketing Cloud account engagement activity, you need to ensure that this setting is enabled. Campaign status, often overlooked, really must be set to active for a campaign to be considered influential. This is something that, if not set properly, can be have your campaign be ignored when calculations about influence are being performed. Campaign members establish a relationship with a contact and a campaign. A contact must be a campaign member for a campaign to have been considered influential to any related opportunities, donations they might have been making. The first association date, this is a key one that we'll look at in some of our calculations that is used in campaign influence calculation. It's the date that the contact first became a campaign member or was associated with the campaign. Member status, Certainly, this is one that reflects the level of engagement with a campaign that your members have. Often it will be something set by a action at the end of an email. So if they've interacted and opened or clicked on an email, you can set their campaign member status to opened or clicked. And finally, opportunity contact role. This is one that is critical at the opportunity level, playing any contacts who are playing an influencing role in that opportunity. And these need to be properly assigned for attribution to work. For example, if you're using Salesforce Nonprofit Success Pack, you may define family members as being influential to household donations. Or peer-to-peer fundraisers could be influential to donations made in support of their fundraising efforts. So these are key as well. Auto association is a term that allows you to set parameters for Salesforce to link your campaigns and your opportunities. And that's quite important to understand. And finally, what happens when that auto association works is a campaign influence record gets created that connects the campaign members to the contact roles who are on that opportunity. So let's look further at that concept of auto association. These are the terms that Salesforce uses to automatically associate opportunities and campaigns. It's one of the key steps to properly configuring campaign influence. And there's two key pieces to it: time and rules. In terms of time, the key variable here is the time frame within which you consider activities influential. This setting applies at the environment level, which can be challenging because you may feel that the time frame that's relevant for one marketing or fundraising channel is quite different from another. We tend to see with nonprofits 6 months being a common time frame that's used, but again, this can be a very subjective decision. This time frame is measured by the number of days between when a contact was associated or added to a campaign and when the opportunity or donation in question was closed. Thinking of direct response, if you're looking for an immediate measure of the influence of an email campaign for donations, you may opt for a shorter time frame setting if that's a principal form of fundraising in your organization. If a donation comes in, you might consider an email received by the contact in the last week to be influential towards that donation. But if it was an email they received a year ago, you likely wouldn't see that email as having anything to do with the donation made today. If your focus is more on medium to large gifts, then taking a longer time to cultivate, then you may look at a longer time frame as appropriate. Again, because this setting is for the environment as a whole, you'll need to strike a balance here across your fundraising channels. With rules, you can start to narrow down campaigns that are considered influential. And this is really important to stress because campaign influence is about measuring marketing influence, not any influence. It's going to be key to capturing the more day-to-day sales type of activities like phone calls and face-to-face meetings that get logged as activities on the opportunity. Now, an outbound calling campaign could be different. It's actually considered a Salesforce campaign that would have a list of members who were part of that campaign. Personal one-to-one versus mass is a good criteria to think about when determining if something is likely to be considered a marketing activity. A common rule that you may want to use is to only assign influence to campaigns of a particular campaign record type: email, direct mail, outbound calling, advertising, and ignore campaigns that might represent other types of activity. Once we've established our ground rules for telling Salesforce when to apply influence, it's important to understand that the calculations of what is happening behind the scenes to determine if a campaign is considered influential to the opportunity. The two key variables that we're looking at are the opportunity created date and the campaign member created date. If we subtract the campaign member date from the opportunity created date, we'll get a number of days. And we compare this to the time frame that we established in our auto association rules. If the value is less than the time frame, the campaign is deemed influential. If it's greater than the time frame, it's not considered influential. So let's look at this with 3 different samples and real dates to help this hit home. In all these 3 scenarios, we're going to use today's date, November 2nd, as the day we became a campaign member. We'll also assume that for our auto association timeframe, we're using 10 days in all 3 scenarios. We can think about this webinar as a marketing activity or campaign in Salesforce that could be influential in your decision to implement campaign influence. And for fun, let's assume there's an opportunity and a value attached to your decision to implement campaign influence. So in scenario A, if you were to implement campaign influence in 2 days from now on November 4th, our calculation would yield 2, the difference between the opportunity realized and when you became a member of the campaign. And since this is less than 10 days, therefore this webinar would be considered influential in scenario A. In scenario B, let's say you wait until the end of the month to implement. Now the calculation between November 30th and November 2nd is 28 days. Being greater than 10, this webinar would be viewed as too old to have had an influential role in your decision to implement campaign influence. And finally, and this is an odd exception, but it works according to the math, let's say you implemented campaign influence back in October on the 15th. Now our calculation actually results in a negative value of -18. It doesn't seem like something happening now could have influenced you doing something almost 3 weeks ago, right? But -18 is less than 10. So yes, this is considered influential, but there's a key caveat here, and that's only if the opportunity in question is still considered open. For most opportunities we're thinking about in the nonprofit space, donations, where the day they are created, they are opened and closed. But if you think about a major or corporate gift, you could open that opportunity the day you identify the intent to make the donation, but it could take you weeks or months to realize that fundraising revenue. So you could argue that campaign efforts done after the opportunity is created could be influential in securing the donation. And this is where you see that negative influence calculation. So I've made a few references to different influence models, and you might be wondering what I mean by that. If we look at time frame, we looked at rules that could be used to determine if a campaign is influential. Now think about the models as another dimension that can determine both whether a campaign is influential and how influential. In this section, you'll start to understand where campaign influence models are and whether they might be the right fit for your organization. If you only have Salesforce, the default model of attribution is called primary campaign source. This is a lookup field on the opportunity record that is associating this donation with a campaign. If you have a digital fundraising system, it might be automatically assigned when donations are imported into NPSP. If you've received a file from your direct mail house of responses to a campaign, you might be importing these and setting that primary campaign source as the direct mail campaign. One thing to note is you can only have one campaign for each opportunity. The primary campaign source campaign will receive 100% of the credit of the influenced revenue in relation to this opportunity. So if the direct mail donation is $100, the direct mail campaign is considered to have influenced $100 of this revenue. This value can be manually overwritten if for some reason you decide that there was another campaign that might have more directly influenced this particular revenue. When you add Marketing Cloud account engagement, you have the option of implementing 3 additional models. The choice of model influences which campaign gets credit and how much credit. And you'll see that credit doesn't have to be all or nothing. In a world filled with multi-touch, multi-channel campaigns, marketers understand the importance of the collective influence of their efforts on revenue. So while you can choose to build a more robust custom attribution model, we're going to focus on the 3 out-of-the-box models that come with Marketing Cloud account engagement. You can choose to enable one or multiple or all of these at the same time, but you must set one to be the default model used, and more on this in a bit. The first model, both Last Touch and First Touch, are fairly easy to understand. Last Touch is probably the most common and often the default model that's used in other digital platforms, including Google Analytics. Last Touch places the highest value on the most recent marketing activity and gives full credit to the value of the donation. Note that I've listed influence eligible campaigns. So this means the campaign still has to fit within the scope of your auto association timeframe and rules that we defined when we set up influence. It's a very easy concept to understand and explain to others, Last touch is good when the time frame between the activity and the action is short, like a direct response campaign. It's good for looking at closing opportunities. First touch, on the other hand, places the highest value on the first eligible marketing activity that the contact interacts with within that designated time frame. This approach is more useful if you're looking to measure acquisition activities that might credit more on what initiated opportunities. Both approaches have the downside of ignoring other touch points. For example, what is an e-newsletter that went out after your direct response email and they open that as well as your email the day before? In a last touch model, the newsletter would get credit despite the fact that the direct response email was the one that made the more direct ask for the donation. A more balanced approach, which allows for credit to be spread across multiple campaigns, is even distribution. In this model, all eligible campaigns within the time frame are given an equal share of the credit for the opportunity. While this factors in more than a single touch point, it ignores the relative importance of each. So a strong direct response ask with an emotional story and a call to action could be weighted equally to a Google search ad, which is pretty basic at its core. But if the person interacted with both of those, each would get equal credit for a donation. Let's quickly visualize these calculations. So in the last touch model, the most recent or last campaign receives 100% of the credit. In this case, of a $100 donation, the mobile campaign is awarded $100 of influenced revenue. In the first touch model, we see that the influence is now 100% associated with the first campaign, in this case, the email campaign. So with the same $100 donation, the email campaign gets credit for the $100 of influenced revenue. Finally, with the even touch, influence is shared equally across all campaigns within the time frame. Because we have 4 touch points, each is given 25% of the credit for the $100 donation. Each campaign is assigned $25 of influenced revenue. If we were to add a 5th touch point, each would then get 20%. So if you have a particularly active marketing calendar and a long time frame established in your auto association setup, it's possible that influenced revenue for each campaign could start to become very, very small. A lot of what we covered is relevant to any organization, not just nonprofits, but I've tried to give you some nonprofit context along the way. Now we're going to get into the heart of the issue, and that's whether or not campaign influence is a good fit for your nonprofit organization. I'll start by covering some general considerations from a marketing and fundraising perspective, and then dig a little deeper into specific fundraising channels. For the marketers in the audience, one important thing you need to understand about campaign influence is that it's somewhat bound by the nature of the platform upon which it's built. Salesforce has its origins as a sales platform, not a marketing platform. Therefore, it's rooted in leads and contacts, often the bottom of the traditional marketing funnel. Pardot, or Marketing Cloud Account Engagement, on the other hand, is a marketing platform focused on acquisition and converting anonymous visitors to your website into known prospects who can then be cultivated with further marketing activities and into ultimately leads and contacts. Our challenge is that for campaign influence to work, the person in question needs to be a campaign member, and that's a Salesforce concept. And to become a member in a campaign, the person must be a lead or a contact. Therefore, campaign influence is ineffective when you're trying to assign value to activities that a person might have engaged with before they became known to the organization. And this applies to common marketing efforts like digital ads, social posts, anything that can be consumed without having to provide personally identifiable information. The other challenge is that it really is heavily dependent on the cookie that would be set when they visit your website that's tied to your Pardot instance. And even then, the known prospect still has to be synced over to Salesforce if they give you your information. So that's the importance of having synchronization between your environments turned on. So all this to say is think about the nature of your marketing activities and what you're trying to measure. A tool such as UTM tags might be an alternative way to capture important insights from unidentifiable traffic. I know we have another great session being offered here by Bill Fetter here at Mardreeman that dives into that topic. Bill's very knowledgeable about campaign influence, and his presentation from a prior year was a great source of knowledge as I built my own understanding of campaign influence. For the fundraisers, let me reiterate something I said earlier. Campaign influence is about measuring marketing influences, not fundraising activities. And this was a really big aha with some of our clients, because many see this as a way to measure anything and make sure that fundraisers are getting proper credit for their efforts too. Think back to the donor stewardship activities example I mentioned earlier, like personal phone calls and one-to-one meetings. Fundraisers will feel, and rightly so, that a half-hour phone call with a major donor prospect was key to securing their donation commitment. And they're probably right, but those activities are not part of campaigns. They are activities recorded on an opportunity record, and as such, they're not campaign membership related and then wouldn't have a related influence. An inconsequential social media ad could end up getting 100% of the credit for a major gift if the donor happened to click on the ad the day after the phone call, but before closing the donation in a last touch model. And that leads to the point that different models are better suited for different fundraising channels. Remember that marketing activities, some campaigns may still lead to campaign membership, but the nature of them, say a peer-to-peer fundraiser asking for donations, should not be viewed as a marketing influenced activity. You can enable multiple models and report on different campaigns based on the model that you feel is the best fit, but there must still be a default model turned on for your environment. If you have NPSP configured to allow household members a contact role in related opportunities, this can distribute or split influence across contacts. Let's say you have two spouses in household and both receive and open the organizational's direct response email, and one goes on to make a donation. Both would be campaign members of that email campaign because they opened it. Both would have an opportunity contact role on the donation because of your NPSP configuration. And if we had last touch model in place that normally gives 100% of the credit, it would be divided equally between the campaign members, and each individual in that household would get 50% of the influenced revenue. The campaign is still getting 100% of the credit, but you might find your reporting shows two influenced opportunities, one for each household member, depending on how you filter your reports. And lastly, campaign hierarchy is another area that must be nuanced. It tends to be more of an issue with even distribution. And a good example often used is a webinar series. So if you've got a campaign for the 2022 webinar series, below that you have individual webinars, and below that individual efforts to promote each webinar. If someone can be a member of multiple levels of that hierarchy, you also risk splitting the revenue influence across the levels of that same campaign, especially with an even distribution model. So the final note I'll make about, which is something to consider when you turn on campaign influence, is that you should choose your default model carefully. While you can enable multiple models, the information related to the default model is what will now appear on your campaign layouts and roll-ups for your hierarchy. So while you might have 100 donations tied to the particular fundraising campaign and normally see these on your related opportunities Lightning component, once you enable campaign influence, this component will get replaced by an influenced opportunities component. So your 100 donations may now shrink or grow depending on the model you're using. And looking at the value of your opportunities, you're only going to see the influenced opportunity of the revenue. For fundraising teams that rely heavily on campaign records and hierarchies for this information, the switch to influenced opportunities and revenue can be a big change. Again, one option could be to leave the default primary campaign source model and enable the other models, but use reporting to draw your insights from them so they don't affect your layouts. Now, as we look at specific fundraising channels, I'll apologize that some of these slides are a little more text heavy, but I wanted this deck to serve as a good reference for nonprofits. So I've tried to deliberately pack with a few more nuggets into the bullets. If we think about direct response, most campaigns are typically multi-channel, consisting of email, mail, phone, text, and other channels. If you want to be able to attribute revenue at the individual execution level, so a particular email, you need to make sure you set up separate campaigns for each mailing. If you were to only have one campaign, but multiple emails underneath that campaign, the recipient could become a campaign member through their interaction with any one of those emails. because the membership is shared across the campaign, not the emails. So if you're only concerned about channel level information, that's fine. But if you really want to track the individual email performance, you'll need to think about setting up separate campaigns for each email that you send. Campaign membership is also often established with completion actions triggered by responses such as email opens and clicks. Pardot does not consider being sent an email as an activity warranting campaign membership. If your organization feels that the simple act of being sent an email should be considered influential, you can manually assign campaign membership to sent and use automations to help, but it's quite time consuming and you'll have to weigh the benefits against the added storage costs of having campaign member records for every email recipient. For online fundraising, considerations can vary depending on how your system integrates with NPSP. But one general caution is to be very aware of the actions that a person can take along the way to making a donation and creating that opportunity. Again, think about what model you're using and the impact of how you're structuring your pathways. If you've enabled even distribution, the influence of an initial marketing activity could be negated by additional steps that the person's required to take to make their donation. Maybe the person saw a Facebook ad, which could be one campaign using a redirect URL. The link could take them to a landing page, which is part of another campaign, which may even have a website plugin or tracking code tied to yet another campaign. So by the time they get to the donation, they might have passed through 3 touch points and 3 campaigns, resulting in each of those getting a third of the revenue share with an even distribution model. To help address this, there's a few suggestions I have to help you plan your campaigns carefully. If you're using landing pages as a conversion mechanism, consider setting up a campaign record type for landing pages, or consider excluding those from your auto association rules, either by name of campaign or by campaign record type. Avoid using redirect URLs that have their own campaign in your emails. Pardot already has email tracking established, and you want that email to get the credit for the donation. If they use a redirect URL tied to another campaign, there's a chance you're again going to split the share between the email and the redirect campaign. Avoid using tracking plugins and code on your donation form. If they arrived on the donation form, chances are they first came across a link somewhere else and you want that to get the credit. And lastly, where possible, send your visitors directly to the donation form so that the marketing vehicle that sent them there gets the credit. If monthly donors are a big portion of your revenue mix, one thing you'll want to be mindful of is how campaign influence will tend to vary with each monthly installment. Each payment is typically recorded as a separate payment opportunity in NPSP, so each would have its own influencing campaign depending on the model. What motivated the person to become a monthly donor long ago will only get credit for the first few early payments as time moves on. For example, a donor that's been on your file for years, what motivated them originally is likely well beyond the time frame of auto association. That initial driving campaign was likely the last touch for a while, but wouldn't stay that way forever. Monthly donors are typically more engaged with your organization and more likely to read things like your monthly newsletter. So if you're employing last touch, don't be surprised to see your monthly newsletter get credit for individual donations. In this case, it's really unlikely the newsletter had any direct role in the donation coming in, but you may see high attribution of revenue to your newsletters as a strong signal that your monthly donors are being retained through the contributions of that ongoing communication. Switching gears to payroll and matching gifts, typically not driven by marketing activity and therefore not something you want receiving campaign influence. It's possible that a marketing campaign influenced a company to get involved or promote or support the notion of employees joining a payroll deduction program, but these donations are not driven by marketing influence. Here, a primary campaign source approach tied to the company would likely be a good approach. Matching gifts, such as double the donation, on the other hand, are influenced by the employee who made the initial gift. So that employee should probably have an opportunity contact role on the donations that are made by the company matches. But again, this is not marketing-driven campaign activity. Similar to household scenarios earlier from our NPSP configuration, and depending on how the system used to make the donation integrates with Salesforce, the employee and the company account may both have contact roles and split influence. For those gifts that have a longer cycle between being initiated and realized, things like corporate, major, or planned gifts, where an opportunity amount might be defined at a certain time but not realized in whole or in part until later on, this is where that negative campaign influence calculation we discussed comes into effect. Think about the impact of your time frame with these types of gifts. How far back might campaign activity have contributed to larger scale gifts? This is one fundraising channel where those really influential activities like high touch outreach might not qualify as campaignable activity. Therefore, the lower engagement touch points tend to show a disproportionate share of their true impact on influencing revenue as a result. The last channel I want to touch on is peer-to-peer fundraising. This is often a huge source of revenue for those organizations with signature fundraising events, especially in the case of national or multi-affiliate organizations. There are many different fundraising platforms used to manage registration and donations, and some integrate with Salesforce better than others, but do often share the approach of using Salesforce's campaign hierarchy to map teams and participants when they're brought in. Donation opportunities for peer-to-peer fundraisers are really the outcome of your fundraisers' efforts to ask their peers for support. These donors support the person and the personal ask. They don't donate because they saw one of your event promotions. Therefore, not marketing influenced revenue. For systems which map teams and participants, different Salesforce campaign record types, you can use your auto association rules to filter these out so that they are not seen as being influenced by marketing. Registrations, on the other hand, are more likely to be influenced by your marketing activities. So this is another example where filtering out participant or team campaigns is being influential so that they don't override the influence of the marketing campaigns that led to them. While registration fees can be captured as an opportunity, there are many details to consider that complicate matters when you're trying to isolate these from donations. Is the opportunity type they're using unique? Are there custom fields from the peer-to-peer provider that might be used to differentiate these fees from donations? And what about when someone self-donates at the time of registration? Do these share the opportunity or are they separate? All considerations you'll want to take into account. So that takes us to the end of our session. For those organizations that have decided this is a tool they'd like to proceed with to help realize some of those benefits we discussed earlier, maybe you want to make a case for increased marketing support or make more informed decisions about your marketing spend. Either way, what should you do if you're ready to get started? I want you to reflect on these important questions that you'll use to help plan your implementation so that you can go in with your eyes open and are prepared to make appropriate choices as you are setting up your auto association timeframe and rules. Ask yourself one final time, based on some of the channel specific points made earlier, does campaign influence fit with our revenue mix? Thinking about your own revenue mix, what model best aligns with our fundraising channels and marketing activity? What time frame is considered influential to us, and is it universally relevant across fundraising channels? Is there a time frame that fits best with the revenue that is driven by our marketing activity? What rules can we use to isolate the influential activity? And as you plan your overall structure of your campaign hierarchy and membership, how can you avoid splitting influence across levels? Most importantly, remember you can always disable campaign influence, switch default models, enable multiple models to achieve your goals that you've set out for yourself. And you can also deploy into a sandbox environment with your real data so that you can take a more staggered approach to implementation. This is a great way to experiment with and refine your rules and see the impact of different models. Take the time to become familiar with how the underlying mechanics of influence work and focus your efforts on marketing campaigns. I hope this session has expanded your view of campaign influence and given you and your team some food for thought as you consider the potential benefit and impact of implementing it with your organization. I'd like to thank everyone who took the time to watch this presentation and commit to your own professional learning and development. I believe we have a couple of minutes for questions, but if you'd like to follow up with me separately, you'll find my contact information here and a link to learn more about Heller Consulting.
All right. We do have a couple questions, so I'm going to go ahead and I do have to share the screen here. So Mike, we have a first question coming in from Maida Ryder. Hi, Maida. I'm going to go ahead and share here. Hi, How do we think of the time frame of an appeal scenario? A direct mail was sent and 2 emails. All could be considered influential.
So again, it depends on the duration of direct mail campaigns. Some do have a longer window than others, often a few months, where you may have multiple packages that are being delivered, complemented by emails. So I think you want to look at the number of executions that are in there in terms of whether they're all considered influential. Certainly if they fit within the time frame you define, if it's 3 months or 6 months, that's often going to cover most direct mail campaigns. If you're setting your model to even distribution, then they would all be influential as long as they fit within that window and weren't ruled out by one of your rules. If you were using last or even touch, it's going to, last or first touch, it's going to pick whichever one met that particular criteria. So if there were 2 emails, the most recent one in the last touch scenario would get it. I guess one more point I should make about direct mail. If you're getting your data from a mail house, you may be wanting to set the association date or campaign membership date when you're doing your file imports, because that could change the influence of a mail package relative to something else that was part of the campaign. If you uploaded the file after the emails were sent, but the gifts might have actually been received and processed prior to the email. So you want to use those factors to help make sure you have an accurate count.
Right, that one is answered. The next question we have here is, so do we manually need to set the primary campaign source field when we first acquire a prospect with the source campaign?
A lot of times the primary campaign source will be automatically associated, especially if you're getting your information from a digital fundraising system. Usually that's a configuration that's set when the connection to NPSB is being set. But it's certainly something that if you're manually entering opportunities, you'll want to be setting that as you're entering the donations. If it's an existing, it's not so much about the prospect as it is the opportunity itself. So it could be an existing prospect or a new prospect.
Great, and we've got one other question here. If a prospect is Pardot only, when they eventually sync to Salesforce, will only their Pardot campaign be considered influential?
As long as the person has a lead or contact record to establish that campaign membership at the time, I think that's the importance of the syncing between Pardot and Salesforce, is that you want to ensure that they have their prospect has been synced over to create that leader contact, so that when the opportunity is being created in the Salesforce, that those 2 elements exist together, so that the contact role on the opportunity is established and that they are able to become a campaign member when that opportunity happens, so that there's alignment between the 2.
Okay, and we've got one last question here in about 2 minutes. So, is campaign influence and the 3 models available with any Pardot version? Let's see, on setting, is there some details? The documentation hasn't said anything.
I believe that the 3 basic models are available with most versions. I'd have to check the documentation just to make sure, but almost all clients we've dealt with that are employing Pardot have had that available to them with all versions that we've been using.
Well, great. Okay, so that concludes our Q&A, and what a great session. Thank you so much, Mike. We are all out of time, but thank you again to everyone for joining us and to our sponsors. We have a lot of great content coming up, so I hope you guys enjoy the sessions. Let us know if you have any questions. Have a great day. Bye, y'all.